Your brain has already decided you're right, and now it's just collecting evidence to prove it. That's confirmation bias, and it runs constantly, mostly without you ever noticing. It isn't a moral failing. It isn't someone deliberately ignoring facts to win an argument. It's something much quieter and much more dangerous. A filter that decides, before you even consciously register a piece of information, whether that information matters at all. Once you believe something, your brain doesn't wait for permission to defend it. It starts scanning the world for anything that fits, and it starts skipping past anything that doesn't. This happens before you've had a single conscious thought about being fair. Here's the mechanism knowledge, and it's worth understanding in detail, because understanding it is the only real defense against it. Confirmation bias operates in at least 3 separate stages, and most people only ever think about the first one. The first stage is search. When you go looking for information, you don't search neutrally. You search for things that will confirm what you already suspect. If you believe a coworker is unreliable, you'll remember the meeting they showed up late to far more easily than the 10 meetings they showed up on time. You'll also, without noticing, ask questions designed to surface more evidence of unreliability rather than questions that could surface evidence of the opposite. The search itself is rigged before it even starts. The second stage is interpretation. This is the one people underestimate the most. Even when you're handed identical, neutral information, your brain doesn't process it neutrally. Psychologists have shown that people will read an identical report differently depending on what they already expected to find, highlighting the parts that agree and skimming past the parts that don't. 2 people can look at the exact same paragraph, the exact same numbers, the exact same sentence, and walk away having absorbed 2 different messages. One person highlights the part that agrees with them. The other skims right past it without registering it as important. A single ambiguous data point, the kind that could reasonably support either conclusion, almost always gets folded into whichever story the reader walked in with. Neither person is lying. Neither person thinks they're being unfair. They're just reading through a lens that was built before they opened the document. The third stage is memory. This is the stage that quietly rewrites your history without you ever catching it happening. Evidence that confirms what you believe gets encoded vividly. It gets replayed, referenced, and reinforced every time you think about the topic. So, it becomes easier and easier to recall with each retelling. Evidence that contradicts what you believe gets minimized, explained away, or simply forgotten, often within days. Ask yourself honestly, when was the last time you changed your mind about a person or a plan because of one single piece of contrary evidence? For most people, the honest answer is almost never. That's not because contrary evidence doesn't exist. It's because it never made it past the memory filter in the first place, so there was nothing left to recall later. Put those 3 stages together, and you get a closed loop. You search selectively, you interpret selectively, and you remember selectively. Each stage reinforces the belief that walked in the door, and by the time you reach a conclusion, you're not really concluding anything. You're just arriving, with more confidence than you started with, at the exact place you already stood. The process feels like reasoning. It functions like decoration. It also helps to understand why the brain works this way in the first place. Because it isn't a design flaw so much as a shortcut that used to be useful. Forming a belief, and then testing it from scratch, every single time, is expensive. It takes time, attention, and energy the brain would rather spend elsewhere. Confirming an existing belief is cheap by comparison, so the brain defaults to the cheap option, and most of the time nobody notices, because most everyday beliefs are low stakes and rarely get audited. The problem is that management decisions are not low stakes, and they get audited constantly, just usually months after the decision was made, when it's far too late to fix cheaply. Now let's talk about where this actually costs money and careers, because this isn't an abstract psychology lecture. This shows up in specific, expensive, repeatable ways inside every organization, and it rarely announces itself as bias. It always announces itself as good judgment. Start with hiring and first impressions, because it's the cleanest example. A manager decides early that a new hire is a strong performer. Maybe it was a good first week. Maybe it was a confident interview. From that point on, every good result this person produces gets remembered clearly and credited to their skill. Every mistake gets quietly explained away as a bad day, bad luck, or something outside their control. Meanwhile, an employee the manager doubted from day one gets the exact opposite treatment. Their wins get credited to easy tasks, good timing, or help from a teammate. Their mistakes get remembered in vivid, specific detail, the kind of detail that comes up again in performance conversations months later. Same effort, same results. Completely different story, built entirely by which evidence the manager's brain decided was worth keeping. The damage doesn't stop at the individual review. Once a manager has silently sorted a team into strong and weak, that sorting starts shaping who gets the visible projects, who gets the benefit of the doubt in a tense meeting, and who gets coached versus who gets quietly managed out. The employee written off early rarely gets a fair second look because nobody is actually looking. They're just confirming. This is how a single early impression, formed in someone's first 2 weeks on the job, can quietly determine their next 2 years, and eventually their decision to quit for a manager who never met their old reputation. That same pattern shows up again, almost identically, inside formal performance reviews. By the time review season arrives, most managers aren't actually reviewing a full year of evidence. They're reviewing a narrative they already settled on months earlier and then selecting the examples that support it. A manager who has already mentally filed someone as a strong performer will reach for the 2 best projects from the last 12 months without even consciously trying. A manager who has filed someone as not quite there yet will reach for the 2 worst ones with the same ease. The review document looks rigorous. It has specific examples, specific dates, specific outcomes. But the selection of which examples made it onto the page was never neutral. It was confirmation bias wearing a formal template, and the employee on the receiving end has no way of knowing that the evidence was cherry-picked before the meeting even started. Strategy debates are another place this hides in plain sight, and it's arguably the most expensive version of all, because it happens at the level of decisions that steer entire teams or entire companies. In a strategy meeting, the loudest or most senior voice in the room usually stakes out a position early. From that point forward, watch what happens to the discussion. Data that supports the early position gets nodded along and added to the deck. Data that contradicts it gets labeled as an edge case, a fluke, or not representative, and quietly dropped from the next version of the slides. Nobody in the room thinks they're suppressing evidence. Everyone believes they're building a coherent argument, but the argument was coherent by selection, not by analysis. The team didn't evaluate the strategy. They built a case for the strategy someone already believed in. Add a room full of people who all want to seem aligned with leadership, and the selective evidence gets a second filter on top of the first, because now nobody wants to be the one holding up the slide that contradicts the boss. Customer feedback interpretation runs the exact same trap, and it's one of the most common in product and marketing teams. When feedback comes in mixed, which it almost always does, teams don't read it neutrally. If a team is emotionally attached to a feature they built, they will find the handful of glowing comments and treat them as representative of the customer base. The pile of lukewarm or negative feedback gets reframed as vocal minority or not our target user. Flip the emotional attachment, and the same team will do the opposite with a feature they were always skeptical of, treating one bad comment as proof the whole thing should be killed while ignoring 3 good ones. The feedback itself didn't change, only which parts got noticed changed. A product team that genuinely wants the truth has to actively resist reading its own inbox like a highlight reel, and that means logging every piece of feedback somewhere before anyone gets to decide which examples are representative. And then there's the pattern from the original example, which deserves to be stated plainly because it happens in nearly every organization that has ever kept a project alive past its natural endpoint. Teams keep funding failing projects because leaders search for the one metric still trending upward and use it to justify continuing, while ignoring the 5 metrics quietly trending down. Nobody sits in a room and says, let's ignore the bad numbers. What actually happens is quieter. The good metric gets pulled into the opening slide of every update. The bad metrics get pushed into an appendix, or summarized in a single vague sentence, or left out of the meeting entirely because, we're still gathering more data. The project survives, not because it's working, but because the evidence that it's working was the only evidence anyone was actively looking for. Money already spent makes this worse, because nobody wants the story of the last 6 months to have been for nothing, so the search for a redeeming metric becomes more motivated, not less. Here's the part nobody expects, and it's the part that should actually worry you more than any of the examples so far. Confirmation bias gets worse, not better, with expertise and confidence. It's tempting to assume that smart, experienced people are naturally immune to this, because they've seen more, they know more, and they've been burned before. The opposite tends to be true. The more confident someone is in their judgment, the less effort their brain spends double-checking it, and the more automatic the selective search, selective interpretation, and selective memory become. Confidence doesn't filter out the bias. It removes the friction that might have slowed the bias down. This is a genuinely underrated danger inside management. The managers most convinced of their own objectivity are frequently the ones running the least scrutiny on their own conclusions, precisely because they've stopped questioning whether they need to. So, what actually fixes this? Not try to be more open-minded. That instruction is useless, because confirmation bias doesn't feel like bias from the inside. It feels like being right. Telling yourself to be less biased is like telling yourself to notice something you're specifically wired not to notice. You need a structural habit, not a mood, and it needs to be specific enough that you can't talk yourself out of it in the moment. The fix starts with a specific, repeatable habit, and it works precisely because it doesn't rely on willpower. Before reviewing evidence for a decision, write down what result you expect to find, and why. This step alone changes everything, because it forces the expectation out of your head and onto paper, where you can actually see it and interrogate it, instead of letting it operate silently in the background while you review evidence. Then, and this is the step almost everyone skips, actively search for the one piece of evidence that would prove that expectation wrong. Not evidence that's mildly inconvenient, evidence that would actually change the decision if it turned out to be true. If nothing you can think of would meet that bar, that's a signal in itself, because it usually means the decision was never really open in the first place. Here's what that looks like in practice, using the failing project example from earlier. Before the next project review meeting, a manager writes down, "I expect this project is still worth funding because the conversion metric has improved 2 months in a row." That's the belief, stated plainly, on paper. Now comes the harder step. The manager has to go looking specifically for the piece of evidence that would prove that belief wrong. Is retention still declining? Has customer acquisition cost kept climbing while conversion improved? Is the team quietly missing every other deadline while this one number gets better? Would a neutral outsider looking only at the 5 metrics nobody has been screenshotting reach the same conclusion? If the manager searches and genuinely cannot find a single piece of evidence that would change the decision, that's actually useful information. It might mean the belief is solid. But if the manager finds that evidence, and it turns out retention has been falling for 3 straight months while everyone kept pointing at conversion, that's the signal the project needed to hear a month ago, and it only surfaced because someone went looking for it on purpose. The same habit works just as well outside of formal reviews. Before a hiring decision gets finalized, write down what you expect the reference checks to say, then call the one reference most likely to disagree. Before a strategy gets greenlit, write down which competitor or customer segment would prove the plan wrong. Then, go find their numbers instead of your own. Before closing out a customer feedback review, write down which segment of users you expect to be unhappy. Then go read their comments first, not last. The format never changes across all of these. State the expectation in writing, then hunt for the one fact that could break it, on purpose, before the decision gets made. That last sentence is worth sitting with, because it points at something most performance and decision-making advice gets backwards. The goal was never to gather more evidence. Most managers already have plenty. The goal is to gather evidence that could actually disagree with you, which is a completely different skill, and one almost nobody trains for. It also works better as a team habit than a solo one. Assign one person in the room the explicit job of arguing the case for being wrong, and rotate that job regularly, so it never becomes personal or predictable. If you cannot find anything that would change your mind, you were probably never actually evaluating the evidence at all. You were just collecting reasons to agree with yourself. That line applies to hiring decisions, performance reviews, strategy debates, customer feedback, and every failing project anyone has ever kept alive 1 quarter too long. The practical takeaway for anyone managing people or decisions is this: build the disconfirming evidence check into your process before the decision, not after. Don't wait for a crisis to force you to re-examine your assumptions. Make writing down your expectation and hunting for the evidence that would break it a standard step in every review, every strategy meeting, and every project check-in. It costs 5 minutes. It's the cheapest insurance you'll ever buy against a decision you make with total confidence and zero actual evaluation behind it. More of these on this channel. Follow along.